had already started
Okay,
it.
here we go. Well, I am so pleased and excited and thrilled to have Raymond Moody here. I've read his books with passion. He's a great writer, philosopher, psychiatrist, physician, and an author and expert on NDE, so NDE near-death experiences. And so I very much want to talk about life after death, what we found, and what, Raymond, you found in your extensive research. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming on
It
today.
was delightful to be with you, and thank you so much for the invitation.
So, tell me about your own personal experience. How did you get involved in being interested in this area, first of all?
Well, I did not come from any religious background. My dad was kind of sarcastic about religion, I gather, after his horrific service as a medic in World War II in the Pacific. I mean, they never talked about stuff like that, but I just put that together. That must have been that he was just always making harsh comments about religion. And I mean, I just was not interested in it. Astronomy was what was interesting to me. And um, in connection with that, what I was most interested in is things that don't make sense. As a very young kid, I got interested in uh, Lewis Carroll, who everybody knows, but uh, also Dr. Seuss is an American nonsense writer. He's not so well known in Europe. Well, I guess he is more now. I read that his books, I'm glad you're sitting down, uh, have sold over 600 million copies. So I was just very interested in from the time I was a kid about things that don't make sense. And I was interested in that already. And then the first time I looked through a telescope, I realized the world doesn't make any sense because I had, we all had as a kid this idea of how big is this thing we're in. Then your mind goes out to the wall, but just a minute, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall? So the only other possibility seems it goes on forever, and that doesn't make sense either. So that it came as a shock to me in a way, and yet it was not an unpleasant shock because I remember specifically thinking, oh, this is like Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll was my thought, that the world is unintelligible. And this sounds really bizarre, but until I went to um, college at age 18, I really didn't clearly understand that there was anybody who took the notion of an afterlife as other than a comic premise. I remember uh, Jack Benny movie I watched when I was a kid was an exposure to the idea of an act, but it just made it a joke. And um, so there I was, and I went to the University of Virginia to study astronomy, but I wanted to take a philosophy course too. And immediately just, I mean, had this instant attraction to Plato. I could
Mm.
show you the place on the page in early September 1962, where it was a couple of days into college. I decided I was going to be a philosophy professor and study Plato. And so at the end of the story of the Republic, the whole Republic sort of comes up to a dramatic point. It's like there's certain things in Greek literature that do that. I remember in Herodotus, for example, that amazing scene of it all squeezing down to the Thermopylae Pass and those 300 guys who made you, me, and you and me, right? And so it was just, and I remember asking, but I, I woke up with a shock to the realization that Plato thinks there is an afterlife. So that's what got me
Mm.
started. And this story was about a man who was believed dead and revived and told going into another world. And I asked my professor about it, Professor Hammond, Lewis Hammond. And he said, well, yeah, these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who had apparently died but revived, and that there was a debate among them, which everyone listening to this will recognize as the same debate as which Plato took it seriously as an indicator of an afterlife. But meanwhile, Democritus, who came a little before Plato, had just sort of figured out by reason alone that solid things, which appear to be unbroken, have to be made up of tiny little bits that are too small to see, which he called atoms. And from that point of view, he said there's no such thing as a moment of death. He said these experiences represent the residual biological activity of the body. And I just thought this was fascinating. I continued to study this, and then in February, I think it was, of 1965, I heard Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of philosophy at, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. I heard he had one of these experiences, so I took the opportunity, as a lot of students did, to listen to him. And I knew immediately that he was real. I mean, I didn't know what to think about this experience, but I knew that George, who is to this day the finest guy I ever knew. So that started it. And subsequent to that time, I've talked to literally thousands of people from all over the world who had this. And I never fell for that thing about oxygen deprivation to the brain, because one of my own medical school professors told me about her empathic death experience, and when we're trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her own mother, that she herself had all these things we call a near-death experience. So, it's not simply oxygen deprivation to the brain, but you can talk yourself the Americanism until you're blue in the face, and still there are certain people who just got to hold on to that. I mean, it's psychological. There are certain people who, it's kind of like they think that the process of knowledge stops when they get their doctoral degree, and that, so the people who are just scared of this opening maybe to a vastness that is hardly even comprehensible, they would rather say, well, that's oxygen deprivation to the brain, but that's a holding pattern, I guess. I mean, I don't know what they would think about the fact that people don't need to have an oxygen deficit to the brain to have these experiences. So that's how I got into it. And it took me a long time to sort of, I give up. You can't draw a logical conclusion that there is life after death in 2022. That's the reality. And parapsychology and such are nice, wonderfully sweet and naive people who practice the pseudoscience. And that is not a personal comment. These are my dear friends I've known for decades, and they understand they understand this about me, that the question of life after death is a philosophical question. It's not yet a scientific question.
And as living human beings, it's very interesting to consider the nature of life, and therefore the nature of non-life, death. And what is that? It is an intriguing question that has gone through generations. When I had brain cancer 3 years ago, I was in the hospital bed and I knew I was going to die. I told my nurses, who were looking after me so beautifully, I told them I'm going to die today, and they laughed at me and said, "You're okay. We've got it covered." But I knew, and I felt myself leaving my body, and there was a period where I can't even put it into any time explanation. There was no time, but I experienced the universe outside of my body, and I returned at some point in the process into my body, and I was asked if I wanted to come back in, and I said yes. I have a child and I need to be here. And so I came back in, and I came back in a different person with a different operating system, let us say, in computer technology terminology. And I came back without any fear, and I came back with an understanding that we are all connected. And I had understood that as a theory in my reading, but I had an experience of it in my own experiential terms, which makes me see the world very differently, and it made me see my life very differently. So it was an extraordinary experience, and one I will never forget. So I'm exploring now more, and having had this experience myself, I'm intrigued about the research, the studies, the many, many examples. And I didn't tell anyone about this, and I know you've referenced this. I didn't speak about it because I didn't want to be considered a nutcase or criticized, or trigger people by this story. And I understand that's something that a lot of people feel. So I was wondering, what are the commonalities that you have understood from the NDEs that people experience?
Well, what people all over the world have told me, it's kind of like you might have had a little mention of Wittgenstein in college a little bit, and I say it like Wittgenstein, not he said that general terms, it's the old view of Plato was that there is some one thing they have in common, whereas Wittgenstein said, no, a general term, it's like a collection of characteristics, right? And it's kind of like that. There's about 15 or so common things that people report, but one person may have 2 or 3 or 4 of them, or 7 or 8, or sometimes the whole 15. And it seems to correlate nicely with how close they got to death. The people with the extremely lengthy cardiac arrest talk about going much further into this. They say they leave their bodies and they watch their resuscitation from a point of view above, and they report going into a state of consciousness that no matter how brilliant and eloquent or multilingual they may be, they say, I just can't describe it. And they say it's like they go through a passageway into a bliss that is so complete love. They say far greater than anything we have experienced in this life as love and compassion. They say that relatives or friends of theirs who have already died seem to be there in a greeting committee. And then most remarkably to me, talk about holographic memory vision, which everything they've ever done appears around them in a hologram instantaneously. No time passes, but they see everything they've ever done. Become aware in this process that even though we all chase something, I guess, I've been chasing knowledge since I was 6 or 7 years old. Some people chase fame or power or money or whatever but people say whatever they were chasing before they went into this, they come back saying that it's that what this is all about is learning to love. And as you described, there's some people say they're told you have to go back. It's not your time yet. You've got things left to do. Other people say they're given a choice. They can go back. And when they're given a choice, they almost always say it's for their children.
Yeah, I was certainly given the choice. It was made very clear to me. I enjoyed being where I was. And they said, it's your choice. You can go back now or stay here. But it's a kind of definitive decision right now. You go or you don't go. What's your choice?
Yeah, and this is just so interesting. I came from a very different path into this than the people who style themselves parapsychologists and all. And I came into this just from the point of view of a person curious about consciousness. And it's a shame, I think, that by trying to put this in as a scientific question, which justifiably offends real scientists. I mean, anybody who thinks this through. But in order to think it through, you have to go into philosophy, right? It's Plato set it out in the Phaedo. This nobody has ever gotten closer to the rational side of it than Plato and David Hume and A.J. Ayer, all of these great thinkers who have pointed out genuine difficulties with the question of life after death, which is just waiting to be solved. As a matter of fact, I want to say here and now that there is a way through to a genuine breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death. And I wish I was a salesman in a way, but I can't get interested enough in money to be interested in selling things. I'm interested in creating things. But
Yeah.
this book here, Making Sense of Nonsense, published about a year ago by Llewellyn, I put all my thoughts together in there, and to say that it's perfectly possible to prepare our minds in advance so that when we have a near-death experience, we will come back and be able to articulate it in a new way. It's already happened once with one of the people I took through this procedure. So we can actually reformat our mind to solve David Hume's great problem. It's David Hume is so, demonized, right? As you know, it's just like, but what a great guy. It's 1711 to 1776 to dating for you. And he said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. And there is an understatement for you, but it happens to be true, right? And then he went on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that, I claim here and now, is now solved. Hume was right in what he said, but he was wrong in his implication that that couldn't be fulfilled. I say that I've worked out a new way of thinking about things, that when you prepare yourself in advance with that logic, then subsequently you have a near-death experience, then you will be able to put it in a new way. And a very wonderful, sweet, kind-hearted, and very eminent artist and scientist who took one of my workshops then, sometime later developed H1N1 and almost died. He was in the hospital for 60 days, lost his leg to gangrene, had several cardiac arrests, and had near-death experience. But he called to tell me that he said, while I was up there, he said, my mind went back to the seminar, and he said, I saw that what you were saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. And this may sound so, abstract and bizarre, but it has the very exciting implication that we can now reformat our minds to think about this in a whole new way and to bring it back to the rest of us. So, we're into for big things here, but, it's like one thing with the field that you and I are in is that it is narrative based, yes. Right? It's like people come to us because they want to hear wonderful stories.
Yes.
Right. And that's wonderful. I've heard thousands of them. I can't wait to hear the next. And then you have to go back to the original difficulty that Plato stated. He said, well, yeah, the story element is necessary because there's no clear concept, right? What does life after death mean? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a self-contradiction, right? So what does it mean? That's no easy task. And so what Plato said, you've got to have some set of concepts to link the experiential narratives with the statement that there's an afterlife. And then what happened sadly in the late 19th century, when science was well established, some very brilliant scientists, but whose critical minds were not devised to, to figure out trickery exactly. Then they tried to make this scientific, and and now there's this whole failed profession of parapsychology. People, I mean, but the tragedy of that is that there's a new way to think about it. You got to go on a conceptual route first, but then when you come back to there's a new way of looking at this. So I am happy and confident that we are now into a period of breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of life after death, and also quite confident that what I call the afterlife establishment is not going to be pleased with this, because that's narrative based. It's whether they like to admit it or not. Really, what keeps them into it is the stories.
And people love a story, and
oh yeah, and all of us.
We all love stories.
Yeah, life itself is story.
Yeah.
What is your personal identity but your life story?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And as I gather, I don't know where you've been wading out into this as I have. I don't know, but I've gotten to the point where I just sort of give up. I mean, I don't know what else to say. There's no logical inference you can make, and the fact is, when my medical friends tell me, yeah, they empathically co-lived their patients' near-death experience, I mean, I give up. I trust these guys' medical judgment to the point where I would actually, be a patient of theirs if heaven forbid I needed to be. But then how can what do I make of their unanimous judgment, all of them, that these near-death experiences and or shared death experiences they had, sometimes with their patients, well, that was real. Not only that, it was real, but it's more real than what you and I are going through.
Yeah.
Right.
It was an interesting turn of phrase you used there, heaven forbid.
Yeah. A deesis. It's a great figure of speech. It used to be literal, right? And it's like in the Middle Ages, if you were accused of a crime, you would invoke deesis. God is my witness, or heaven forbid, whatever. And then they would take in their bare hand white hot iron, walk with a certain distance to, I mean, now it's a figure of speech. Martin Luther King said, Lord God Almighty, free at last. Or you hear it all the time, but it's a very fascinating figure of speech to see how it is. It was once a literal thing. It was like you were literally calling on God to witness. And now it's just something we say without thinking about it.
And what have you learned about the connection into religion and God, which you managed to sort of get around in your writings, because it does trigger people?
Yeah, and something, I don't really care about triggering people. I mean, I've never been so what I've always been interested in, and I sense you too, what I want to know is what is.
Yeah. I underlined something you said, which was, I don't care what people think. Since I had my NDE, I just don't care. People can do what they like.
That's right.
In my own space.
Now, if somebody has a legitimate, they found a flaw, then please tell me.
Yeah, fine.
Yes, absolutely, because it's thank God for my training in philosophy. Speaking of deesis, that when I put something out there, my attitude is find a flaw in this, right? Because if somebody finds a flaw in it, then I'm moved closer to the truth by seeing my mistake. But if they can't find a flaw in it, that gives me more confidence. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't get this thing about people being so sensitive about their views being contradicted.
Sure.
But in terms of God, and again, I just wish I were a salesman because I got 2 kids still at home. But this book, in terms that I put it together recently, it's on Amazon.
Let's have a
God
look.
is bigger than the Bible.
Could you put
God
it
is
up?
bigger. Yeah,
God is bigger
it's
than the Bible. Mm-hmm.
God is bigger than the Bible. And I address that very question you just
Beautiful.
asked.
Beautiful
How do I
title.
put this together? And where I've come with it is, by the way, this is delightful talking with you. You kind of remind me actually of my grandmother Waddleton's family.
Oh, thank
They were
you.
from around Manchester.
Oh, I know Manchester very well. I used to work there, actually.
Uh,
That's so nice.
so, um, so anyway, I, the way I will get right to the point and say, I give up. I
Mm,
just don't know any other thing to say than I'm caught. It's like the only thing I seem to be able to say that describes all these observations is that to my utter astonishment, there is an afterlife.
mm,
And I just, I mean, and I say I give up advisedly because, one of the tragedies of this field that you and I are in is that there is no real opposition to it.
mm-hmm,
It's the pseudo skeptics, as I call them. Those are just reformed parapsychologists. They have the same working assumptions and the
mm,
same fallacies. And the big fallacy they start with is the fallacy of calling themselves skeptics.
mm,
But
mm,
what they say is, I'm a skeptic about these near death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain.
mm,
And what they show by that very remark is that they are actually practitioners of willful ignorance.
mm.
Because if they just took the trouble to look at Sextus Empiricus,
Oh, yeah.
outlines of Pyrrhonism, um, and all these wonderful great books that were put together by the great skeptics of
Mm,
antiquity,
mm,
led and commanded by Pyrrho, Pyrrho, about 20 years after the death of Aristotle.
mm,
The skeptical philosophy, which was also a way of life, was a rigorous adherence to logic coupled with a refusal to draw conclusions. And the reason that they did this was not to be cantankerous, but rather, if you think about it, logic is a way of generating conclusions, right? So the
mm,
skeptics thought, well, what if we put the rules assiduously and rigorously to use, but in the end, we refrain from a conclusion? That's what skepticism
mm,
means. And the reason they did it was that, number one, it is really mind opening. After a while, that's quite an experience. And also, if you think about it geometrically, and everybody is running in this direction to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to avoid a conclusion, then you see things on the periphery that nobody else noticed because they're running this way.
mm,
So that's the essence of skepticism. So
mm.
when that, very caustic, and I found them very adolescent, actually, that mentality. But they are, it's a
Yeah.
very adolescent mentality.
Yeah.
And when they say, I'm a skeptic about these near death experiences, I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. If you unpack that remark, what they just said is that I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. So that's a self contradiction.
Mhm.
It's like that group that falsely calls themselves skeptics is actually, that group is actually humanism, is what that
Mhm.
particular point of view is. But it shows that they're not really very serious people, that they don't bother to look up what their basic
Mm,
concepts and
mm.
mean.
Interesting. When I recovered from I recovered from my illness, and then I was in the place where I had to recover from having an NDE and an
Mhm.
unfolding of awareness, let's say, and a different perspective on life. I felt I had this existential crisis because
Mhm.
I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know what I was seeing and what I was
Yeah.
comprehending as life. What have you found regarding this? Is this a familiar thing?
Yeah, absolutely. People say it's like a lot of people describe a kind of nostalgia
Mm,
for the play, where they were,
mm,
and always kind of missing it. And also kind of waking them up anew to the incomprehensibility of life.
mm,
And oh, quite a number of people over the years have mentioned to me that during their life review, that when scenes arose in which they had been learning something, that this being that they were with, which some say Christ, some say God, an angel, a being of light, or whatever they say, but they say this being of complete compassion and understanding. Um, that when in scenes where they're learning something, that the people say there's not words, but that the thought comes, something to the effect that that's interesting that you're learning, because even after you come over here permanently, this process of learning goes on.
mm,
And I've heard a lot of people say that, learning seems to go on from what they could put together for
mm,
eternity. George Ritchie said it's the process of learning, I gather, goes on quite literally for eternity, he said. And I
mm,
just hear that a lot.
mm.
And it certainly
Because I lost a big chunk of my
encourages.
memory. And so I had no reference points to go back to. I was
Mhm,
literally, and I am now, here and now. And
mhm,
I have difficulty in remembering anything, which is
mhm.
kind of refreshing, but also tricky, obviously. But it does
Yes.
bring a sense of being very present in life to every moment, which is a lovely way to live. Sometimes it's uncomfortable if you can't remember specific things. And so many people say to me, "Oh, you remember when?" And I keep saying, I said it today to someone, I don't remember that. I am just here now.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. The way I put it together is that this is kind of the movies, I guess, for want of a better term. I was blessed with being my interest was forensic psychiatry, and I worked with psychotic killers a lot. But um, I was also interested in geriatric psychiatry, and because I was older than the average psychiatry resident, I'd gotten a PhD in philosophy and was a philosophy professor for 3 years. So I went to medical school. So therefore, and I also had a book to my credit, and I was known around town. So I was it when they needed somebody for a year for the VIP clinic. I mean, the mayor or the chief of police, they can't go in the front door of the mental health clinic like you and me, right? We're there, yeah, but it was a nice arrangement because it is embarrassing, right?
Yeah.
So, they would come in kind of this, and I got to see for a year. It was the geriatric clinic dealing with these very distinguished people, and I just heard it repeatedly, like Raymond. The older I get, the more I develop this uncanny impression when I look back on my life that it has been a story or a movie or a
Yeah.
play or a novel, whatever word they would use.
Mm,
And and I think that's pretty accurate. A very great performer once told me is she was relating how when she was coming off the stage after the last night she was performing this role she was internationally famous for, that she then several years later she had her near death experience and she was saying, Raymond, the closest I can describe that feeling of the near-death experience was to that night I walked off the stage after that role I've been playing so long. And I've heard other actors and actresses say similar things. And so I think, you know, it's the essence of life is story. Your whole consciousness is focused to, you know, when something new happens to you, you weave it into your life story, right? So, you know, consciousness is narrative based.
Yeah. And what about consciousness post-death of the body?
Well, again, like, I mean, I have to be in a situation. I realize the difficulty of drawing a logical inference, and at the same time, I can't help but have to acknowledge, yeah, I mean, apparently there is. Now, I also kind of realize that we can't figure out from this limited framework we're in what exactly it's like. But you know, a lot of people tell me that it's kind of like when you're waking up in the morning and coming out of a dream. It's like where you're going from the unreal into the real, and you're having trouble holding on to what was that dream like, you know, the details escape. And they say it's very much like that, except that this is the dream, right? That they say that it's like you're waking up from the dream, only this dream is this life.
Yeah.
Is what they've said. Yeah.
I have a very good friend at Cambridge University who's professor of in the consciousness psychology department of Cambridge Uni. And he and I were discussing this morning about creativity and ideas and where they come from. We're writing a new chapter for a book of mine. And he was discussing the concept that where you're just drifting off to sleep, that moment, as Einstein and various great thinkers talked about having their spark moment just in that entry point of coming from into a nap, let's say, into sleep, and they might drop the object they were holding, and it's in that moment where the extraordinary can happen in terms of creativity into that space of just coming out of sleep or into sleep.
That was one of Freud's 7 arguments for the existence of the subconscious mind, that you can, just before you go to sleep, if you put an idea or question in your mind, you wake up the next morning and it's magically answered. And there have been some great people, like you said, who harnessed that. Thomas Edison, his co-workers would say sometimes he would get a funny look in his eyes when he was working on a problem, and he would say, I think I better go take a cat nap on that.
Yeah.
He would get back in his studio and he would recline. He would hold metal ball bearings, one in each hand, have metal dish pans out to the side beside him, so that, you know, you can stay in that state, but if you start going to sleep, your muscle tone will go to 0. So his hands would slip out of his lap and hit the ball bearings would wake him up. And so, yeah, and you know, I mean, I don't want to put myself in the category with those other people, but I've done that all my life. I just hear all that from people who make their living creatively all the time, that wonderful hypnagogic state, as it's called.
Exactly. That's exactly what we were discussing this morning. And it is that wonderful state of being able to, or if you go for a walk, and we were talking about the power of meditation, which is almost a close form of no mind, if you like, where when you go into meditation, many ideas just drop in that were otherwise not available to you.
That's right.
It's
so wonderful. I mean, it's after a while, I went through a period back in the 80s when I was doing it too much. I discovered back in the 80s that rediscovered something I discovered in grammar school, was that if you look into a surface, when I was a kid in school, they still used ink right? You had an ink well.
Yeah.
And I remember one time the ink spilling on my desk, and I was looking into the ink, and you see these visions start to form,
Mm,
right?
mm.
And so I found that I could greatly facilitate that process by gazing into a mirror. So I just kind of recline in front of the mirror, gaze into the mirror. All kinds of things would come. I would be sometimes hours a day just watching those images. And some good creative work came out of it too. Creativity is, I mean, I'm with the Greeks on that one. It's like I don't see anything that's ever led me to believe that creativity is any other than a supernatural process. I mean, I'm sorry, but I think it is.
What do you mean?
And
What do you mean by that, Raymond?
well, I was a comedian for a while,
Were
for
you?
example.
Mm,
Yeah, I wanted to be a comedian from the time I was a kid, and actually, I got to do it for a while. But I was getting too many invitations to be consistent with continuing my psychiatry
mm,
residency at the time. But creativity, it doesn't come from me. Yeah, where does it come? Somewhere here.
mm,
These things start, and I'm as surprised as anything else,
mm,
as anybody else, by how it comes out.
mm.
Um,
I just
so, and
show
I,
you
this
my book.
artist,
This is
yeah,
The
all
Art of
right,
Creativity. That's my
all,
latest book. And
all
I'm
right.
very interested in where ideas
Oh,
come from, how we get,
yeah,
where is this
yeah.
beautiful
It's you
pattern?
pointed above. That's where everybody points. I talk to artists on it doesn't come from me. They say they point vaguely up here. And
Yeah,
Paracelsus, the founder of iatrochemistry,
yeah,
made a great comment. He said, "A man," and sorry about the
yeah.
antique language, but a man who decides to write a book first creates a sort of heaven in his mind from which the work he desires flows into him.
Mm,
And that's a pretty accurate
love
representation.
that. Love
I,
that. Beautiful. It's
yeah,
gorgeous. Well, you have inspired me so much. As someone who's had an NDE and has had to work out life post NDE, your work has been so much of a comfort to me, knowing that I'm not going crazy and that this is a thing that happens. So I want to thank you for all the amazing
oh my
words you put
goodness.
out.
Thank you, to the contrary, for telling me about your experience and for having this wonderful conversation
Oh,
as it
it's
has.
such a great pleasure to talk to you. It really is. And I wondered, I've read your books, and I wonder what Raymond is like, and to know now and to feel the energy of what you're of who you are is just a wonderful experience.
Well, thank you so much, and likewise, let me see the cover of your book again, if you would,
Sure.
just so I can. The Art of Creativity. So
Yes.
I've seen that someplace.
Yeah.
Have I? Has it been
Probably.
on?
Yeah. Yeah, I've done quite a lot with it. It's 7 Powerful Habits to Unlock Your Potential. And the gorgeous David Lynch, film director, gave me a lovely front cover testimonial.
All right.
Yeah, and
Creativity
I'm updating
is
it
the
now
great.
with my friend from Cambridge Uni. We're looking at the latest in research that shows really how the brain is orientated with ideas, coming up with new inspirations and so on. So I'm like you, I'm fascinated with how things work and
It's just
what
the
that means for
greatest.
human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Creativity is the greatest
it's
experience
such a
there
great
is.
thing, and it keeps
And
us healthy, it keeps us healing, and it keeps us connected. For me it's
and
a
it's
great
so much
connectivity,
fun.
with everything. I love meditation, I love getting ideas, and I love writing
Yeah.
those things down. And I feel blessed that, having
Yeah.
been connected to this stream of deep consciousness, and the stream of what life is about, really, and finding out and exploring what life is about. There's no better way for me than to do it through creativity.
In my book that I mentioned, God is Bigger Than the Bible, I talk about creativity. And in the United States, we have these people who are trying to get our kids to be taught the Genesis version of creation in their biology classes, right? So, I mean, that's hasn't gone anywhere with the course, but they keep trying.
Yeah.
And so I write in that on my book, as I have a chapter on that. I say, you know, I'm a creationist, but I'm a new creationist. I think the creationists stop too soon, because I think God is creating everything all the time.
All the time. And everything changes, everything moves. That's the exciting thing about being a human. You can never say, okay, we've done it now, this is it. No, it keeps on evolving, it keeps on changing and moving, and so do we. And that's the exciting thing. Raymond, I absolutely love you. And
I love you too,
I
sweetheart. You're just
have loved our chat. I loved it. And
this is wonderful.
I will be speaking to Bill later, and I'll tell him about our wonderful chat. And I'm very excited to have a look at these books you've shown me. So I can't wait to have a read of those. And I
think you'll like the one about nonsense.
Sure, I'm a big fan of Dr. Seuss.
For what happened in the West was that Plato was the first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative. And when he did, he linked the literal with the true false distinction, which is why we say the literal truth. But he also realized that nonsense is a whole big deal. He even had a whole dialogue on it. And he realized that there's different types of nonsense, like 'twas brillig and the slithy toves to gyre and gimble in the wave is one type. But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's different. Or listen to this. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this city. Is nonsense too, but or hat thoroughly the if zoom how zest is nonsense, or it goes on and on and on. And so Plato was aware of that. And he was aware that it does things to your mind and it makes you laugh and all. But Aristotle, as much as I love him, he was just the greatest guy, probably a lot more fun to be with than Plato, Aristotle. But he got it wrong about nonsense because he was just too uptight. He was so uptight. And his favorite word for nonsense was random talk. But I could show you in 10 minutes that far from being random talk, nonsense is paradoxically less random than ordinary meaningful language. It's paradoxical, but even though the common sense view is that this is the level of meaningful language, that nonsense is down here, is the way common sense is. But it's actually the other way around, that nonsense is an accrual, like a second order of language on top of language. See, but Aristotle missed that. And so that's why you and I can't think logically about unintelligible things. See, well, I fixed that. This is students. Even after 30 years, I get still emails and calls from my students sometimes. Thank you for that. It's like, and like I said, the nerdy people, I tell you, the intelligence folks, it's like the image people have of them. It's like James Bond and the movies. But this is imagine the hair. As Kant says in his Craig, that's the intelligence people. And they are interested in this. It's like in 4 countries so far. So, I don't know what it is, because they're just so, to get those jobs, they have to be squeaky clean. Right? Sure. So you can't figure out what they're asking you, but it's the fact that they have added me 4 times or 3 times. That means that they think there's something to it.
Amazing. Raymond, I have loved our chat. Thank you.
Me too. This is just delightful.
It's just gorgeous. And I very much hope this is not the last time we talk. I'm sure
Yeah.
that we will come across each
I
other.
miss Spain. I'm too old to fly anymore, but I
Yeah,
miss
yeah,
there's just no place, and you can't get it in the United States.
yeah.
It's just, I mean, you can, but it's not like, yeah,
Well,
sadly.
I will be coming to the States soon, so I maybe we'll get that opportunity. We'll leave it over to this beautiful space in which we inhabit. So thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you so much. This is delightful.
Delightful, Raymond. And good luck with the writing. I'll send your best to Bill.
You too.
And
Right.
yeah, lovely. All right. Well, much love. Take care. Lovely
You.
to spend time with you.
You too.
Thank you.
Likewise. I hope
All right.
again to do it as well.
Yeah.